Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I am Ryan Henson, the Chief Executive of the Coalition for Global Prosperity, and we are thrilled to be hosting this event with conservative young women. I will tell you a bit about the coalition, then I will hand over to Ella, who will chair the event. The Coalition for Global Prosperity was set up 3 years ago and indeed was founded by Theo Clarke, one of our excellent panelists this afternoon, because we believe that Britain is at its very best when it acts as a force for good in the world, and that a smart and effective aid budget leveraging British values and British expertise really can and does transform lives across the world. UK aid is not just the right thing to do, it is also the smart thing to do as well. Because as COVID has shown, in our era of globalization, what happens overseas does not always stay overseas. It is therefore in our national interest to help provide sustainable solutions to long-term challenges such as epidemics, armed conflict, and climate change. And to do that effectively, we need to continue to invest in international development. Supporting others is the right thing to do because even before the pandemic, over 130 million girls were not in education, and very often poverty was the underlying cause. In very human terms, this is a catastrophe. But gender inequality is also estimated to cost the economies of developing countries $9 trillion a year. So in today's event, our excellent panel will explore how British leadership on the world stage, in a year when the UK will host both G7 and COP26, can help make these moments a catalyst for change so that we move closer to a world where all women and all girls have equal rights. It is right that the UK government is leading and should lead in this area, and it is absolutely right that we should be discussing it this afternoon. So with that, I will hand over to Ella, the National Chair of Conservative Young Women. So Ella, over to you.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you so much to our panelists for joining us this evening. We're such fans at Conservative Young Women of the work of the Coalition for Global Prosperity, and I'm personally a massive foreign policy nerd, so I'm really, really thrilled that so many of you have given up your Monday evening to discuss these important issues with us. Conservative Young Women is on a mission to get more young women involved in public life, but we welcome all genders and ages. But if you know a young woman who you think would be a great councillor or a great association chairman or an MP, please do get in touch with us because we want to put as many women forward as possible. Just like in around the world, which we'll be talking about tonight, we need more women involved at home in the UK in order to make our politics fairer and more representative. I'm joined by the most incredible panel tonight. So if someone's tweeting, please tweet #SquadGoals because this is my ultimate ideal squad. First of all, Theo Clarke MP, who founded, as Ryan said, co-founded the Coalition for Global Prosperity, and last year became the MP for Stafford. She is involved in all sorts of elements of political life, potentially most relevant tonight, the International Development Committee, and the government's asked us to do some special trade work with Kenya as part of her remit, which is very exciting. We're also delighted to have Charlotte Leslie, who is the Managing Director of the Conservative Middle East Council, which is, how old is CMEC, Charlotte? 75 years old?
I'm not sure CMET would make it into the young women category. It's over 40 years old.
Over 40 years old, and one of the party's biggest and most important foreign policy groups, and deals with all sorts of exciting issues across the Middle East and runs some fantastic events as well. Charlotte was the MP for Bristol North West, and she was the youngest woman, I think, in Parliament when she was elected at just 31. So another fantastic, inspiring Conservative young woman. And then finally, Nimco Ali, who is the UK's probably foremost anti-FGM campaigner, for which she was awarded an OBE. She's the co-founder and CEO of the Five Foundation, and has also been asked to be the Home Secretary's special advisor on ending female genital mutilation at home and abroad. So welcome to our panel. I'm going to start with what I think is just the most important question that really sits at the heart of all of these issues. And that's why, when we consider foreign policy, I think a lot of people think of tanks in the desert or digging oil wells or trade relations. not everyone necessarily thinks of gender equality first and foremost. And I think the world would be a lot better if they did. So Theo, if I come to you first, why is feminism and gender equality such an important aspect of foreign policy?
Well, thank you so much for having me this evening. I actually currently sit on the Women and Equality Select Committee in Parliament. And I think that one stat that always jumps out to me is that over 50% of the UK's population is female. And I think that's why I became a sort of ambassador for women in the UK and overseas, was that we needed to have a voice because so many decisions were being taken in government by men which impacted on women. I think the most famous example I always think of is when Obama brought in the tampon tax being abolished in the United States, and he was lobbied by his two daughters, and he suddenly realized that actually it's men making these decisions, and because it didn't directly affect them, they weren't bringing in the legislative changes that needed to be made. And I think the thing that really strikes me, and this is from my work with DFID around the world, is that women are just not getting access to quality education. When I've been out on the ground in particularly sub-Saharan Africa, visiting with local villages, and it's just very clear that, you know, girls are dropping out after primary school, they're not getting access to the same opportunity that the men are in their villages. And that has actually a huge impact on the economy of these countries. Just to give you a stat that if every girl was educated in their country and went to school for at least 12 years, then they reckon that lower and middle income countries would add 92 billion to their economies. So for me, this is not just a question of equality of opportunity, it's actually about helping countries to lift themselves out of poverty by making sure that women have access to the same opportunities as men.
I think that's so true, and that education statistic is just phenomenal. I mean, Nimco, you do a lot of work in the UK, but also in Africa, particularly in Somalia and Somaliland. From your perspective, why do you think gender equality hasn't been at the centre of decisions? And when you're talking to MPs and ministers about why gender equality should be at the forefront of our thinking, as opposed to point 6 or 7 or 8, what are the points that you make to them, and what do you think actually cuts through when making the case?
Yeah, so thank you for having me again. And I definitely echo a lot of the things that Theo said. And it's not just 50% of the UK's population, but it's 51% of the world's population is women. And one of the reasons why gender equality, again, is not there is because they're not around the table. So they're not making those decisions. And ultimately, one of the things I want to just kind of say, what Ryan said, is that poverty is not there because of gender inequality. Gender inequality, so poverty exists because of gender inequality rather than poverty creating gender inequality. If you have 51% of your GDP, which is women out of education, mutilated, and not being able to work, then poverty is going to be a reality. And for me, one of the key conversations with UK leaders is, and actually, G7 leaders, is that, either you care about women, or if you don't, then you need to care about yourself. Africa's population in the next 2 decades is going to be over close to 3 billion. And those 3 billion children, and those are going to be born to young adolescent girls who are forcibly married. That is going to create an economic, issue where the fact that people are going to have to leave the continent, they're going to have to come over here. In places where FGM is more than 40% on the continent of Africa, there is war, there's famine, and there's extreme terrorism. So ultimately, actually really empowering women and girls is a key element to global security and prosperity. So I do speak to their, I do think a lot of the Conservative and the Labour MPs that I speak to are feminists, but if they're not, then I think the key case is global security, and our own prosperity depends on gender equality and real feminist foreign policy.
I think that's so true, and so much of that is just so astonishing that there are even places where FGM is more than 40% of women. I think that's really, really harrowing. To come to Charlotte, obviously you've been working across the Middle East in your latter or recent career anyway. Where gender equality plays different roles in different countries. I mean, I think a lot of the time we think of the Middle East as being homogenous, and that couldn't be less true. But in all your experiences working there, why does gender equality now play such an important role for you?
It's really interesting, isn't it? I think for a lot of the time, gender equality is kind of seen as a niche issue. But of course, 50% is a really, really big niche. And anyone who's looking long term, we tend to look very short term, particularly in the West, actually, very short term. Anyone looking long term looks at how you unleash the economic and social potential of that 51%. And what I found incredibly interesting and sometimes very challenging is being around in the Middle East, particularly the Gulf at this point. And the Gulf is seeing an era where they know they can no longer be dependent on oil revenue and income, and are beginning to understand in a very deep way that they've been wasting 50% of their population, and that's their women. So you're beginning to see a leadership driven, in some areas, empowerment of women for those economic benefits. And of course, I think something that gets overlooked is the long-term change that empowering women has. It's not just a flash effect, it's an intergenerational effect that goes on and really cements cultural change. And it's very interesting that we talk about the UK being a global leader. What's very interesting is seeing other countries are coming to recognize for self-interest and because it's the right thing, the benefits of gender equality. And I found that fascinating and quite unexpected to see.
I think one of the things that we have to remember when we're talking about gender equality is this covers a really, really broad spectrum. So in some places we'll be talking about the gender pay gap and caring. Those are some of the bigger issues, perhaps in the United Kingdom, right through to the abuse and trafficking of girls and women. So we do want to get through as much as we can tonight. But to come to some of those more developed countries issues, Theo, when we think about kind of foreign policy and gender equality, I think a lot of people are thinking of Middle East, Africa, Global South. But actually, if we look at the United States, I'm just going to read the statistic because it is just so astonishing and depressing. So in the final jobs report of 2020, there was a pretty horrifying finding. Not only did the US workforce lose 140,000 jobs in December, but women lost net 156,000 jobs, while men gained a net 16,000. In other words, women accounted for 100% of the labour market's first month of job losses since the kind of shaky recovery that we saw in May. So this is an issue that is just being heightened by the pandemic. In terms of COVID relief and COVID recovery, how should we be positioning gender equality in the way that we think about our relations with other countries?
Well, I think you picked up on a really important point there, Ella, about the impact of COVID on women around the world losing their jobs. In fact, on the Women and Equality Select Committee at the moment, we've just been doing a major inquiry on the gender response to COVID, and we've been interviewing witnesses over the last few months to hear directly from mums, school teachers, people on the front line about the impact. And it is very clear that it is the vast brunt of women who've been taking on responsibilities for childcare at home. And that's why so many of them have unfortunately had to take a step back from their day jobs. A lot of them have gone down to part-time, or as you said, are completely unable to do their job at all. You know, I was talking to a constituent the other day who's got 6 kids at home with 1 iPad, which they're sharing for homeschooling. And the poor mum just can't be at work and have 6 kids at home and no one looking after them. So I think it is a really tough challenge. And I think we need to be talking about these things on the world stage. And I do think that this year, the UK has a major opportunity. First of all, we're taking over hosting the G7. We've also got the COP26 climate change summit in Glasgow in the autumn. So the UK has a really unique role this year as a global leader on this issue to say, let's put this on the agenda, let's get other countries to step up. And in my view, it's not acceptable that women are taking the brunt of childcare and having to step back from work. And that reinforces to me why it's so important as well that women are being educated. I mean, a statistic I read today was that 90% of primary school children in low-income countries are still unable to read or write. So that's a whole generation that are just simply not going to have access to good job prospects. And really the only way out of the pandemic and to pay for the vaccines and the healthcare that we need is by having, you know, functioning economies which can pay their taxes and have a good financial system that works. And the only way we can do that is to have private sector companies, you know, creating wealth and creating jobs and giving opportunities to women. So I think this is the moment for the UK to lead. And I do commend the government for the work they've already done. I think the Prime Minister, before he was in his position as Foreign Secretary, was a real committed champion of the girls' education agenda. I've been very pleased to see that under his leadership as Prime Minister, that has really continued. And certainly when we introduced the Foreign Secretary at our evidence session a few weeks ago, he recommitted to girls' education as a top priority for the new Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, which I was very pleased to see.
Which is fantastic and very encouraging. Of course, we are very proud to be the party that's produced two of the two female Conservative prime ministers, whilst no other party has produced any. But really, that's not a statistic to be proud of. You know, I think what Ruth Bader Ginsburg said about, you know, I'll be content when there's 9 female Supreme Court justices because there's been 9 men and no one batted an eyelid is quite fair. Charlotte, having been an MP yourself, what is the importance of female representation in the House of Commons, in the FCDO from a civil service side, and just having more women represented in senior positions? I mean, I'm thrilled that we've got Karen Pierce at the UN and female ambassadors in Germany and the United States, but why is actually having women in these leadership positions so important?
It's hugely important. And going back to your COVID question earlier, COVID's been the great revealer, hasn't it? It's very easy to say we're a world leader at this and we're doing extremely well at all these things, but actually COVID has shown us that we need to be quite humble about where we are in the UK in gender equality, inequality because of poverty and income. But when coming to Parliament, I think it's incredibly important. And it's something that I realised during my time in Parliament, how important it is to have women as well as every diverse group in Parliament. I don't like making generalisations, but I have found that a lot of my female colleagues have been less pressurised by status considerations, tend to be more collaborative in the way they work, tend to find it easier not to take credit for things. I think often there are social pressures for men to take credit where there aren't those same social pressures for women. I don't know what the reasons are, but I do hugely value the collaborative working that I find amongst women in leadership positions. And a sense of security where, I hate to be cliche, but as Margaret Thatcher says, if you want something said, ask a man. If you want something done, ask a woman. I think there is some truth in that. And I think there's a fascinating reason as to why. But if you want collaborative working, and who was it said, there's no limit to what you can achieve if you're prepared not to take the credit for it. I think women have a tremendous amount to add in that, as well, of course, as attracting more women into politics because they see people who look like them.
I think that's so true. I think role modeling is so important. I know that Theo and Charlotte have both been fantastic role models for me in my political career. Nimco, on this COVID theme, I just want to brag on Nimco for a minute, because the FI Foundation is doing the most phenomenal work across Africa, really taking very, very innovative ways of working when it comes to being community-led and being women-led. And I just wonder, Nimco, if you could reflect on the work of the FI Foundation, especially with regards to COVID, and what you're doing in the community to empower women, both economically and socially. Apologies, you are on, yeah.
I did the classic still on mute that you're talking. I wanted to kind of just reiterate what Charlotte said, or actually just point to what Charlotte said about women not taking credit for what they're doing. And that has fundamentally been the issue with the way that we fund development in Africa, with the fact that a lot of this at the forefront have been African women who've been leading the conversations within the community. What COVID has done, as both Charlotte and Theo said, is the fact that actually shown us the gaps in the inequalities and the way that we've been working. But what it's also done is actually silence the white noise of massive NGOs and their rhetoric. So what we've been doing at the FI Foundation is actually funding those people who have been doing the work. So grassroots activism, thanks to incredible partners like One Young World and others who actually gave us the ability to have the cash in our hands in order to directly fund women. In Kenya, this year alone, we lost over 4,000 girls in 1 month to FGM. But with as little as £1,000, we saved over 100 girls. So the reality is that there is this massive PR call about investing in Africa, investing in women, and talking about feminism as a brand, but the way that we deliver it, especially through a political lens, has been very problematic. And it is extremely racist and sexist the way that we work. So if we deal with sexism here in the UK in terms of board level conversations, the way that we deal in poverty-stricken countries is actually more problematic. So what the FI Foundation has been doing is actually proving the litmus test, where the fact that if you put money in the hands of women, then not only do they empower themselves, but they also lift their own communities out of poverty. And that is something that we have to be able to champion as women, who each and every one of us, economic independence and economic justice has given us the opportunities that we have today. And if I again quote Ruth Ginsburg, what's the difference between a clerk and a Supreme Court judge? One generation. and we have the ability to lift millions of women in Africa from being uneducated and trapped in patriarchal communities into their leaders of their own communities and their own country.
That's so inspiring. I mean, I think we could probably have a whole evening talking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, couldn't we? A really, really great question. I think Nimco touches on this point about intersectionality, that, you know, the combination of all of our different identities can sometimes, for some people, leave them in a position of more privilege, and for some people leave them in a position of where they're oppressed on numerous levels. And we've had a great question from Tara Mary Moore, who lives with a physical disability and also has suffered brain damage when she was 14. She's now 35 and absolutely inspiringly is on her way to becoming a district councillor. So if you live where Tara Mary is, I hope you'll be out campaigning for her as soon as we can get on the doorsteps. But just coming to this issue of intersectionality, I know, Charlotte, we've discussed it when it comes to religion and women, or race and women and things like that. You know, what can we do more? Because I think we're all people with a certain amount of privilege by being here and being engaged with politics, to be a good ally and make sure that we are not just looking at one type of equality, but we're really trying to dismantle systemic oppression.
Absolutely, and can I just big up Nimco as well as Theo, because the work that Nimco has done is absolutely extraordinary. And maybe this is an example of why women are needed in public life, because we might spend the whole evening bigging each other up. But it's very easy to see inequality through one lens, and often, as you say, that they cross over in lots of different ways. One thing that I've found in particular in looking at difficulties with faith, religion, and sometimes culture, and our relative view of it, is when to say, and this is something that Nimco is really good on, is when to say this is unacceptable, regardless of culture or whatever, anything else, like FGM, and when to say this demands a little bit of delicacy. For example, I used to be the chair of the all-party group on Saudi Arabia. When I first went to Saudi Arabia, I went there very reluctantly. I didn't want to go. I'd heard terrible things about it. I went and found it an absolutely fascinating place of change, where a lot of the inequalities, including poverty as well as women, were being tackled, but they had to be tackled slowly because of a very conservative religious culture. And it's very easy for someone like me to come in and say, whoa, this is a long way from where you guys need to be. But if you try to rush it and you try to impose your view as a very privileged British person on a country and a place that's very, very different, A, things won't go well, and B, you're exhibiting real arrogance. And Ryan talked earlier about British values, and something I really believe is a core British value is the value of humility and listening and understanding. And I think when you can begin to listen and understand where places are coming from when they are genuinely trying to do good stuff, that's far more effective and actually upholds British values. I'm a complete T.S. Eliot fanatic, and he's got this brilliant quote. And his quote is, "The only wisdom we can hope to acquire is humility. Humility is endless." And I think in foreign aid and foreign development, I think that's a very good maxim.
It's such a good maxim. I think it's Confucius also said, humble makes smart, arrogance makes stupid. And I think that really, you know, sums it up. When we think about these kind of things, Theo, obviously we are currently sitting in relative comfort in the UK, but I know that you have been on the ground, especially during the Ebola pandemic in West Africa. And when you reflect on that and the role that the British government played, particularly in Sierra Leone, what lessons did you take from that coming into this pandemic? And what lessons do you think we need to take forward to make sure that we can really, really chalk up the learnings from COVID-19 and apply them to the next pandemic, which is inevitable? I think we may have lost Theo. So if I pop that over to you, Nimco, and just to kind of go to one of the questions from our audience around quality education, what needs to be done to ensure that girls are staying in school and not just reaching kind of an adequate level of literacy, but having the opportunity to go on into further education? And why do you think it is that women are being kept out of education? We've got a good question from Chloe Grant. Do you think it's lack of resources, or do you think it's sexist attitudes that are really at the heart of the education divide?
I think so. One of the key things is the fact that if a country is poor or if a family is poor, nobody's educated. But if only girls are not educated, then there's a specific issue for that. And that is about sexism and the value of girls placed within that kind of context. girls in Africa still are seen as a commodity between families. So where we used to legally trade women for land and for things like that are still happening in Africa. And the only economic network, or the only economic system that girls can actually exist within, is marriage. So the reality is that we have to change the value of girls to not just the community, but to the country. We have to be talking about safety secondary to that, is the idea of the fact that we can talk about girls' education as a hashtag and a girls' education as an aspiration, but if there's no security for girls, so if girls are having to walk to schools through places where they could be raped, adopted, and so on, if the girls are still being subjected to FGM, if there's no access to toilets, then the idea of actually girls attending school is not going to happen. So education doesn't happen in a vacuum. It has to be supported through an economic development of the country and of the state, and jobs created for women that haven't been educated, so then the next generation can scale up and do the next thing. And then there also has to be safety at the heart of that. I think that for me, that is one of the things that I find astonishing, is the fact that even from the Foreign Office or anywhere else, prior to Helen Grant being appointed, we could talk about girls' education without talking about security. Girls are still massively at risk of sexual violence within school, and girls are still massively at risk of sexual violence within the community on their way to school. And if those things are still an issue, then they're never going to be able to get to a school that's built. So unfortunately, it is not about resources, but it's about actually intentions, and for us to be working with countries in order to economically empower themselves and their communities, rather than this top-down approach where Westerners come in, build a school, and assume everybody's just going to turn up because the values are already set through the concept of the things that we implement. So yeah, I think it's a multiple it's an issue with multiple layers, but one of the key things is really working within those countries and within those world leaders in order to see girls' values as citizens and not actually as commodities within a community.
I think that's such a great point about just the reality on the ground, and how often, you know, what seems like a great plan here in Whitehall, once we start deploying it on the ground, isn't necessarily practical or ethical, to be honest. Theo, I don't know how much of my question about the previous Ebola pandemic you heard, but obviously you very bravely were volunteering on the ground in West Africa. When you reflect on that, what lessons can we take from the previous pandemic and COVID-19 in terms of future pandemics? But also, what role did you see gender equality or inequality playing out on the ground when you were there during the Ebola crisis?
Thank you. Sorry, my Wi-Fi cut out just at the opportune moments. Well, really, first of all, just to echo what Nimco said, she's absolutely right. We need to be working with, governments around the world. But I do also think investment is really critical. I think one of the reasons that DFID was able to make such a difference in Sierra Leone is, first of all, the UK government has spent years in that country. We had extremely strong historical links. And secondly, we very rapidly scaled up our investment. So really within 24 hours of the Ebola response, DFID was able to send out teams to deploy in the region to help with that outbreak, and we had the
I'm gonna if everyone else has also lost Theo, I apologize. I'm just gonna pop this question to Charlotte. We've had a lot of people being in touch about the climate crisis and its disproportionate effect on women and girls. So a really, really good question from Claudia Craig about how we can make sure that, through the climate crises which we're about to encounter, and so many countries already are, how can we take care of issues like education whilst that's happening? And also a really good question that came in from Leila Bousbar about the Indigenous women, Black women, women from the global South bearing a heavier income from the impacts of climate change, and ensuring that these women have voices at COP26 this year. And so I guess those two issues are both really key. I've heard COVID-19 described as a dress rehearsal for climate change, which paints a pretty bleak picture. So I wonder if you could reflect on the particular role of climate in the gender equality battle.
Thank you, Ella. And of course, that's kind of the key question of our times, isn't it? If COVID is the great revealer, then climate change is as you say, the main event. It's hard to know how we can really ramp up what we are already doing. It feels like a very gradual process, and whether that gradual process will be fast enough. We have made steps. There are more women representatives and more women in positions of authority, both in the West and across the world, and there has been before. But is this happening fast enough? I think we have a tremendous opportunity from COVID to understand the kind of inequalities that get exposed by these major global events. And I very much hope that that's going to be the focus of conversations. And I also hope that COVID has taught us something we've already discussed, that the world is a very small place and nothing is an island. So what happens over there has an impact over here. And essentially, when the chips are down, unfortunately, what you tend to find, both with individuals and individual nation states, is that self-interest does tend to rise to the fore when things get tough. I think we need to work really hard on illustrating why it's within all our interests to get this solved. Because whilst we would all like to think that morality and drive to do the right thing will carry us through, what we've learned from history is it's not always quite enough. And I think we need far more enlightened self-interest to motivate major decision makers and perhaps those who may not be convinced of the arguments on their own merit, that this is something that's completely essential and very urgent.
I think that's so true. Theo, just coming back to you, because we did lose you, unfortunately, reflecting on your experiences from the previous pandemic.
Sorry about that, terrible Wi-Fi today. Yes, well, as I was saying, I think that the most important way to work together on the ground is to have local partners who can deliver services to local communities. So what I saw in Sierra Leone specifically was we had international expertise from the British government and the experts that we have in Britain coming out to West Africa and partnering with local organisations on the ground. And that for me is the critical point, and that's how we're going to help tackle gender equality around the world, but also all these issues we've been talking about today, whether it's democracy, human rights, and access to education, is none of us can do this on our own. It's about having shared resources. It's about having commitment from governments to actually fund these commitments. And I should say that I was very pleased that the UK has announced additional funding from the UK aid budget, particularly to improve education. And we've also announced that this summer we are going to host a major education partnership summit with the government of Kenya, which is to support the Global Partnership for Education Replenishment Funds. And that for me is a really good example where governments are working together, like Kenya and the UK, to actually encourage other countries to step up and become donors. And then in country, you've got to partner on the ground with those local grassroots organisations who are the ones on the front line. So for example, in Sierra Leone, Restless Development, who are funded by DFID partly, they were the ones who had local advocates in really every single region across the whole country. So during their pandemic, they could go out to the villages and explain about hand washing and how the virus passed from person to person. But we couldn't have done that if we didn't have the local grassroots organisations on the ground to assist.
I think that's so important. It really is about finding your community champions and working with them, listening to them and empowering them financially and with the resources that they need to allow them to do their jobs, because they're the most effective people. And no one knows this better than Nimco, because we could send in as many experts from the UK into communities where FGM is rampant, and I don't think we'd have much impact. I really, really want to unpack this link between where FGM is prevalent and where there are major security issues and war. And I think a lot of people, I think for them, that's maybe a contrast that they've not necessarily made before. What is it about abuse of women and girls that both leads to violence in a causation effect, but what is it also about violence that leads to the abuse of women and girls? Can you unpack that a bit for our audience so they can go away and chew on what they could do to be of help?
I think honestly, it's basic humanity. It's for the fact that where you're holding 5-year-old girls down and cutting their anatomy in order to sell them for more cattle or to marry them off at a later date for more, or even put them through such severe forms of surgery that in order to protect them from rape rather than challenging the concepts of rape or what's happening, then it does corrode society. And I think as an African, I can call that out. And it's really interesting in the sense that we are co-hosting this educational summit with Kenya, but we also, as a British country, have to as Britain, we're with a global platform, have to use our voice in order to say that the Kenyan government hasn't enforced its duty of care in order for some of these girls have been subjected to FGM. The reality is the fact that this country has been able to prosper and actually develop to the state that it has because it's educated women, giving them access to employment and giving them legal protection. And when those things happen, so if we think about even 40 years ago, when certain women in this country couldn't open bank accounts, they had fewer choices to do. So once women are economically empowered and economically given choices in their country and become citizens that vote, then real security and safety becomes a reality. In every single country where FGM is more than 40%, poverty is a reality. Civil war is either a reality as well, or almost on the brinks of civil war. And that's all just because there is no respect for basic human rights. And you can't build a society on flawed foundations. And that is just the reality of it. So we have to be able to say that if you do not respect the most vulnerable people in the country or in the world or in your community, then you won't be able to respect anything else. So that there isn't going to be no peace and prosperity in Africa. There's going to be no end to poverty as long as we're mutilating girls, we're marrying them off in order without their choices, and denying them access to education and even basic things such as immunization. So it's just development is not a theory, is a reality. But in order for those things to happen, there also has to be basic legislation and legal rights to it as well. So a lot of people will want to talk about the anthropological look of Africa, but I think if we just look at it quite literally, it's like the fact that they are treating their own without any due care, and then nothing's going to actually change in that. So so anywhere where girls are being sold and mutilated, there literally is no prosperity or no peace. And that is something that we have to be massively concerned about on this side of the world, because as Charlotte says, when somebody sneezes, we all get a cold, and COVID has actually literally taught us that.
I think that's so interesting to show that, where there is general insecurity, women and girls end up being the most vulnerable and the most abused, but also that just the trauma caused by these generations of abuse do have genuine societal outcomes. Theo, we've had a really good question come in about the role of gender equality as a priority for the government, not just education, but beyond. And how can we make sure that all aspects of gender equality are included in the new FCDO priorities and the integrated review? That's a really good question from Laurie Lee. So not just, okay, right, we do education, and that's the bit that we do for women and girls, taking on the issue with a real kind of full vision with our eyes wide open and being prepared to tackle even the most difficult topics.
Well, I think the first thing is to make sure that everyone on this call and around the UK is making this case to parliamentarians and to the government. If you think sort of 20 years ago, climate change was quite a marginal subject, and now we're hosting a major global conference in the UK, that was because of pressure from local activists, people writing to their MP and saying, this matters to us, this is important. And if I look at my postbag from my constituents, I have to say that the vast bulk of what they're writing to me about is local issues in Staffordshire, like getting access to their vaccine. And it's only a very small proportion of the mail I receive on international issues. So I think if we really care about tackling gender equality around the world, you need to make sure that, constituents are writing to their members of parliament and saying, this matters to us. We want you to raise it in parliament. We want you to raise it with ministers. We want you to put pressure on other governments to keep this as a key objective. And I should say, I do think the government has done a lot on this already. I was very lucky a few years ago, I went out to Ghana with the Foreign Office as part of their Westminster Foundation for Democracy programme. And actually, it was really inspiring. It was with women all across Africa who were thinking of standing for public life, mixed in with ministers and very senior women in leadership positions in Africa. And that entire programme was being funded by the UK aid budget. It was something where we were sending out our British parliamentarians to deliver training and partner with people from South Africa, Botswana, Rwanda, Tanzania, all of these other countries. And I think from speaking to those women at that conference, what they said that they really needed was, first of all, mentoring, secondly, expertise, and thirdly, funding. And I think we take for granted a lot of that in the UK. I know we've talked a bit tonight about encouraging more women to stand for office. I'm a huge advocate of the Ask Her to Stand campaign. I think it's done an amazing job of increasing the pipeline of women such as myself to stand for Parliament and get elected. But are those opportunities there for women around the world? I think in a lot of developing countries, they're really not. It's still not considered, usual for a woman to stand for public office or to become a chief executive of a company. So I think it's partly about changing the culture and also ensuring there are role models for these young women around the world to follow and to copy and ultimately see themselves in those positions themselves.
I think that's just so true. I think, that there was a great Foreign Office campaign that I think some people thought was a bit cheesy when they had, they had all the great female leaders of the Foreign Office, your foreign secretaries, ambassadors, and so on. And there was a mirror that sort of said, now can you see yourself? And a lot of people were quite almost a bit sneery about it. But the impact that having a really strongly articulated gender equality policy within the Foreign Office has been really, really impactful. And we now have more women in senior leadership positions than ever before, and probably the most of any Western nation. So we've got to be championing these things, and it does really make a difference. I wonder, Charlotte, I'm keen to reflect on diversity in terms of country outreach, because whilst it's very easy to talk about Africa or the Middle East or LATAM as just a homogenous region, obviously that's not the case. I'm half South African, and my experience of Africa and in the place that I've been to will be very different from women who live in Mali or Chad. And working across the Middle East, of course, you've got such a diverse range of countries there with, yes, much in common, but almost as much that could be different or nuanced. For someone trying to get into foreign policy, who may not have had the opportunity to work abroad or travel much, that can be a bit overwhelming. How would you recommend that people learn more about other cultures, get involved, and educate themselves in order to be able to make a better foreign policy contribution?
That's a really good question. And you're absolutely right. People talk about the Middle East as a homogenous entity, but of course it's not. It's very, very diverse. As is Africa, as you say. It's very difficult to understand a place without going there and getting under the skin, which is why CMEC has made such a priority of taking parliamentarians to the region so that you can build friends. And if something happens, you can not just rely on the party briefing, but text your friend who's out there. Politics is only ever all about people. That's what I learned from my time as an MP. And you have to talk to people and meet people to get really a view of the country. But I think if you're not able to do that, and it's a hugely privileged position to be able to, I think the starting point is knowing that you're not going to be able to just read all about it. I think there are some extraordinary documentaries that are around. People are now able, from all parts of the world, there's always a language barrier, but there's Google Translate, to put out their own content. You have to be quite careful to contextualize what you're watching, but I think that's a whole avenue into the way that different countries work that is very valuable. But also, as you say, it's not just gender inequalities. And that's something you do see across the Middle East region. Poverty inequalities are huge as well. So in a lot of countries, you're going to do a lot better if you're if you're a well-off woman than if you are a poor young man. And as Nimco talks about security issues, of course, that has a huge impact for global security, because we all know that humiliated, disenfranchised young men cause huge problems for national security. And on that, I think if we're going to drive change across, I think this is a constant for all regions, if you are going to drive change, you can't just ask people to give up something that they're used to, give up a way of life, give up a view of women, without being able to say, this is going to get you to a better place. We're not just asking you to change things or trying to drive you to change things so that you lose out and you feel even more humiliated and more useless in your society. This change is going to make you feel better about yourself, the country, and your society. And we've got to be able to help countries paint that brighter future if nations are going to want to have that motivation to change for themselves.
Absolutely. And you see some pretty stark figures of, this is the benefit, economic benefit to your family of educating your daughter and the income that she could bring in, versus this is what you might make from selling her into an arranged marriage. And sometimes it does really come down to pounds and pence. And I mean, it's a pretty brutal way to look at it, but it can be very effective. Nimco, we've had two very good questions about domestic violence and the increase in domestic violence in the UK, but around the world during lockdown, from Rosalind Grant and from Hannah Bondi. I think one of the things that I really, really like about your advocacy is like, yes, we can empower women more and we can do more for women and we can educate women more, but like men have a role to play here. And it's not just like, let's include men and men can be feminists too. It's not all the fluffy stuff. It's also a case of like, men need to stop raping women and men need to not beat their wives. And yes, of course, we're aware that sexual violence, domestic violence can affect all genders. But I think that there is a really key message about change amongst men that I think some people are quite scared to talk about because they don't want to be confrontational. You are not afraid of being confrontational. And how would you reflect on the role of being honest about the work that men are doing and the role that men are playing in the gender equality divide?
So do you know what? I'm a heterosexual woman with 4 brothers, so I believe in redemption, and I believe that there are good men out there. So ultimately, it's about having that conversation. It's about saying the fact that not all men are born evil, and also that there is the ability for men to change. And what has been really exciting about the violence against women and girls strategy that I'm working on is not necessarily just about the fact that we're identifying violence, but we're also saying that there is a role for education and a role for rehabilitation when it comes to the way that men have acted. So for me, that is how I work. Though the reality is that one of the things is that the Me Too era, the Me Too conversation did not do is the fact that it did not deal with many men and many of us who defending men that we love that actually did things that were wrong. So there has to be a point to say, actually, there needs to be some truth and reconciliation between men and women. And we have to stop. We have to be able to work towards not living in fear of those people that we love the most. So it's a complete understanding of the fact that men can be brutal, but men can also be part of the solutions to this whole issue. And that's what it is going to have to take 100% of us, and that's both men and women, in order to get to the world where equality is a reality. And I know within my own community and within my own continent and beyond, sometimes a lot of the anger and the hate towards women comes from a place of fear. So I have to also do my work and say that as a strong Black woman, I'm actually not to be feared within my country, but it's actually, how do you allow women to be seen as an asset? And there's a quote that I always refer to is, "Seldom do you see the potential of a man in a boy, but you always fear the woman in the girl." And there are too many people out there that are actually living with this thing of actually fearing little girls turning into women like me, which should not be something that should be feared. It should be something that should be celebrated. So I think it's like, it's open dialogue, a real celebration of the fact that it's going to take both men and women in order to get to the egalitarian world that we're working towards.
Yeah, I hope tonight everyone's felt it's been a real celebration of strong women. I really just want to wrap up with our fun quickfire round. Well, I find it fun. I hope everyone else does too. So coming back to our point about educating ourselves, I'd love to ask each of the panel to recommend a book that they think could be really useful for people trying to educate themselves, either about gender equality or about foreign policy. I'm going to give shout out to Nimco's book, which is really, really excellent and reflects, it's a series of essays from really inspiring women about womanhood and the importance of women in the community. So I really, really recommend it. So Charlotte, should I come to you first? Your recommendation for our audience.
Oh, thanks for that, Ella. I'd recommend Letters to a Young Muslim by Omar Saif Gobash, which is a brilliant description by a Muslim man trying to bring his children up well of the kind of choices he thinks they're going to face.
Great one. Theo, I'll come to you next.
Sorry, I'm muting. I would say Christina Lamb's new book, where she's interviewed women across the world about the experiences they face in some of the world's toughest places. And also, just back to the points Charlotte made about understanding things on the ground. Also, there's an amazing documentary that was made about Marie Colvin in Syria, which is probably the most heartbreaking documentary and the shocking 2 hours I've ever seen. But, you know, I've not been to Syria, I've not been to Homs, I don't know what it's like on the ground. But after 2 hours of watching that documentary, it gave me a real sense of why we're giving money to support people in that region.
Great one. Well, good 2 recommendations. Nimco, what's your book recommendation?
Great. So my book recommendation would be Becoming by Michelle Obama, because I think that's honestly, I think it's it's a conversation of a woman that finds her voice, and there's also a real conversation about how it's a generational push. So basically, her mother is the foundation, and she goes forward to the point where she is living in the White House, and hopefully love to see her as president. And seeing Theo had mentioned a documentary. There's a documentary called Praying the Devil Back to Hell, which is about this, which is about the Liberian women trying to end the war in Liberia. Liberia ended up getting the first ever female African president, and because there were women around the table, sexual violence fell, FGM fell, like, you know, their economy went up. And that, exactly one of those things is the fact that on the continent of Africa, women are making things happen on a day-to-day basis. And once they get around the table, they don't just think about themselves, they think about the whole community. community. So I know it's not necessarily a gender thing to say, but the women do actually think broader and care more when it comes to leadership. So Praying the Devil Back to Hell and Michelle Obama's book I found quite comforting.
Those are such great recommendations. So next, what is a quote that you live by, or a woman who's really inspired you in your career? We'll go to Theo first.
I actually have loads of quotes in my office. My school motto was Carpe Diem, which I think now I'm an MP, I hopefully live by. I think the one I really like is shoot for the stars and you'll land on the moon. And I think it really sums up that some women just don't feel like they can put their hands up, or they can go for that job, or stand as an MP, or do something because it's just out of their reach and they've not seen someone do it before and they don't think they can. But my answer to you tonight is women can do anything if they put their mind to it.
And a woman who's inspired you, Theo?
Gosh, so many people. I think Hillary Clinton would be an inspiration, simply because she was the first female presidential candidate to stand in the United States. And I look forward to them having their first female president at some point in the future.
Yes, absolutely. Sooner rather than later. Nimco, what about you? A quote and an inspiring figure?
Well, my quote at the moment is more of a theory that I've created myself, which is a broken clock is right twice a day. So the whole point is, and that honestly, it's about the fact that there are a lot of people who you wouldn't necessarily assume that the solution's coming from, and they sometimes are right. So, which kind of leads into my other thing. My other quote is never take yourself too seriously. And I do an incredible serious job, but never take myself too seriously. And the women who are the women that I look up to are the women who are the forefront every day, actually doing work that is tireless, and it's safe, which is about to change the trajectory of humanity if we do, when we end FGM by 2030, it's going to change humanity. So those are the women that I find a lot of respect and inspiration in at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. What about you, Charlotte?
It's not a very inspiring quote, but it makes me laugh and it makes me feel not alone. And it just says, it's a woman who says to a man, "I'm sorry, did the middle of my sentence interrupt the beginning of yours?" And I just think most of us will probably have had an experience like that, and it just makes me laugh. My inspirational woman, as Nimco says, actually there are so many inspirational women, particularly across the Middle East, who are doing extraordinary, groundbreaking work. I'd like to give a shout out for a special friend. She's called Rasha Al-Khamis, and she's setting up women's boxing in Saudi Arabia, which is really quite something. And she is an absolute dynamo and an inspiration.
Fantastic. Well, what a brilliant, great note to end on, inspiration. I hope everyone's found this panel inspiring, just in terms of the number of levels of that you can enter the gender equality battle and really contribute yourself. I think these are just three most incredible women who are doing so much to promote gender equality at home and abroad, and really reflect the role that Britain can play, both from a governmental level and in terms of our civil society, and the work that we can all do as individuals to spread an important message that gender equality isn't just important or desirable, it's essential. I'd really like to thank the team at Conservative Young Women, particularly Christine Wallace, who's done a lot of work in putting this event together. So thank you, Christine, and the amazing team at the Coalition for Global Prosperity, who had the idea for this event and do so much to not only promote the work of Britain, but to make sure that we're all paying attention, and that, as Theo says, we can hold parliamentarians to account to make sure that they're addressing the issues that are important to us. Please do join Conservative Young Women at conservativeyoungwomen.com if you haven't already. It's been such a privilege to be with you here tonight, and our amazing panel, Charlotte Leslie, Nimco Ali and Theo Clarke. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening and stay safe during the rest of lockdown.